So, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about robots. And I thought we could start off by sharing this letter I wrote to myself in 2010. It's a little worn, but my handwriting is terrible. But it says, wow, 21. Well, almost. Hope you got a car and a driver's license. You've probably been real busy in college. Hope you're doing good. Bet you're on the soccer and baseball team. You'll be an athlete, scientist, dino digger, astronaut, or maybe a teacher. You'll be one of these, I suppose. Bye.
Francis, that's so
Francis. And, you know, I wanted to share this because at the time, my cone of possibilities was pretty wide. And, you know, it just makes me think of cone of possibilities. Our dreams for the future are often based on what we know to be true in the present. So for 11-year-old Francis, you know, he was really sure that his interests would be the same 10 years in the future. And that's really this kind of linear trajectory. And in this case, it's not really harmful, but when you start to think about people in power crafting the future using this same mindset, it gets a bit scary. So today's discussion is really going to be a PSA for why we need a diverse set of nonlinear futurists. We're going to talk about robots and artificial intelligence. And when I think about robots in popular culture, they really fall into these two distinct camps. So I've kind of decided to call these two the dishwashers and the destroyers. The dishwashers are the servants. They're docile, law-abiding, and they exist to help humans. The destroyers are the rebels and disruptors. They're killers, and they pose an existential threat to humanity. So I thought it would be fun to play a quick game in the chat. If you could share one example of a dishwasher or a destroyer. And then maybe, Laura, if you don't mind, if you could just kind of read out a couple that people come up with. The one that I had for dishwashers was like C-3PO. You know, he's not really built to wash dishes, but I feel like if you asked him to, he would. Yeah, so what are some of the other ones people came up with?
For a dishwasher, you have Rosie from the Jetsons.
Mm-hmm.
For a destroyer, you have Dolores from Westworld.
Yeah.
Anita says, I, Robot, good and bad.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, a lot of and maybe all of the destroyers kind of initially start out as dishwashers, and then there's this like snap when they, you know, completely turn into these killer machines. So I wanted to kind of look at what the roots of our fears around robots are. And I guess maybe just to preface this by saying, this is really thinking about what from sort of US Christian perspective. So, you know, if we think about a causal layered analysis, these are really the fears that are, you know, at the very bottom of the pyramid in the myth level. We have these cautionary tales about playing God, this sense that humans are conscious because of the original sin where we disobeyed our maker, and we kind of project those narratives onto our intelligent machines. So when it comes to playing God, I mean, you know these stories. It's that scientist in the lab shouting, "It's alive!" You know, it's science versus nature. It's Frankenstein or Jurassic Park. But you know, in all these stories, playing God leads to destruction. when it comes to disobeying God, it's this fall from grace or the original sin. And we kind of have this argument where if we disobeyed our maker, then our creations will disobey us. And I came across this recently. Someone said, the first word of consciousness is no. And so that really kind of gets to this, where is this tipping point? We want to make dishwashers as useful as possible and avoid destroyers at all costs. Where does that leave us? What does it mean to walk right up to that line and not cross it? I think this story in a magazine called Mechanics Illustrated from 1957 really comes out and says what a lot of our robot stories are about. It's a little scary. It says, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, but by 1965, slavery will be back. But don't worry, it's robot slaves. And this just makes me think about who is this story written for? Whose utopia is this? And I want to share this video of James Baldwin speaking. If you've seen the movie I Am Not Your Negro, you might recognize this clip. Let me know if the sound is not working.
I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you agree that human life is an academic matter. So I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive whatever we must survive. But the Negro in this country, the future of the Negro in this country is precisely as bright or as dark as the future of the country. It is entirely up to the American people and our representatives. It is entirely up to the American people whether or not they're going to face and deal with and embrace this stranger whom they maligned so long. What white people have to do is try to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger, I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. The question you got to ask yourself, the white population of this country has got to ask itself, North and South, because it's one country, and for a Negro, there is no difference in North and South. It's just a difference in the way they castrate. Is the American fact. If I'm not over here, you got to find out.
Sorry, Aaron, can you mute yourself?
Am I not?
No.
It says I'm muted. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, not Aaron, Marin.
Oh, sorry guys. I thought my phone was muted, so I thought that did it. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's really windy.
I'm trying to get this.
I can't be a
I want to get that
pessimist.
last.
If I'm not the nigger here, and you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you got to find out why.
All right, so I love the way James Baldwin speaks and just the way he puts things into perspective. I think about those questions in this clip a lot. And I feel like they're also relevant in a lot of ways to the way we think about robots. And, if we're creating this, and, this doesn't really apply to like an R2-D2. It's more Dolores from Westworld. If we're creating this kind of near copy of a human, this self-aware, intelligent being, do we still think of it as a tool? And are we crossing the line into slavery? Are we creating this underclass? And if so, like why? Like why do we go there? Why do we need that? And how might that kind of corrupt our souls in the way slavery did in the past. And so I think it really comes back to the cone of possibilities, right? Like, whose cone of possibilities do we see reflected in our visions of the future? You know, who's the one looking? And are those the same winners who wrote history? So I shared 2 videos that Wired put together on Slack. And these are videos where a robotics professor from Carnegie Mellon reviews some of the most popular representations of robots in TV and film. And I was curious to see how many of these stories were created or directed by white men. And surprise, surprise, out of the 24 TV shows and films featured, only 22 of those were created or directed by white men. Only one had a woman director, and then Westworld gets kind of half credit because one of the co-creators is a woman. And Making Mr. Right, the film directed by Susan Seidelman, I'd never heard of before, but it might be, you know, one of the first or only movies where there's a relationship between a robot and a human, where the robot is a man instead of a woman. And I know this is a larger problem with Hollywood, but it worries me that old white men are the ones telling stories about our potential futures. And, you know, maybe is that why we see these recurring themes of the dishwasher and the destroyer? Sorry. But yeah, so I think we need other perspectives. And we can first look to Afrofuturism for inspiration. I wanted to start out by talking about the Shirley card, because I think it's a really important reminder that technology is not objective. So the Shirley card is what lab technicians would use to develop color film. They would use this photo of a white woman with brown hair to calibrate the colors. And every other skin tone didn't come out as well. And it wasn't until chocolate companies and furniture manufacturers complained about the colors in their product shots not coming out as well as they would like that Kodak stopped using the Shirley card. And so today we see this play out with facial recognition systems that misidentify Asian and Black people up to 100 times more often than white people. Or the Google facial recognition AI that labeled Black people as gorillas. And, you know, I think this quote really captures why representation matters. You can't become what you can't accurately see. And, you know, this photo of a young girl looking at the portrait of Michelle Obama went viral. And, you know, I love that. The artist who painted Michelle Obama's portrait, Amy Sherald, talks about how white collectors come up to her and ask if she's ever going to paint white people. She finds it interesting that they recognize the absence of themselves in a room full of her paintings, but don't recognize the absence of people who look like her in the greater narrative. And you know, I think Jordan Peele really nails it with this quote about casting a white dude as the lead. You know, he kind of challenges you to think of a story that hasn't been told with a white male lead. He says, you know, I've seen that movie. And so I really love this quote from Toni Morrison about how being a Black woman writer is not a shallow place, but a rich place to write from. It doesn't limit her imagination, it expands it. It's richer than being a white male writer because she knows more and she's experienced more. And, you know, this idea from Teju Cole, another writer, that darkness is not empty. So you might not know their stories, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. So, okay, so just to come back to Afrofuturism, I think first it's helpful to understand that Afrofuturism is not just Black people with jetpacks. It's not retelling the story of the Jetsons, but with a Black family. It's really reimagining new ways of being without the constraints of whiteness. It's centering Blackness and the Black experience and telling stories through that lens. So now I'm going to share a few things that I've been inspired by lately. This is by no means a primer on Afrofuturism. It's more of like a mood board. And the first are these models from the artist Bodis Isaac Kingales from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think the point he makes here about the importance of making models is really insightful. So the US is really good at this. We export our models around the world through things like Hollywood. But what if we fixed that trade imbalance and imported as many models as we exported? The next piece of inspiration is from Octavia Butler, one of the most famous Black science fiction authors, and a professor at Pomona College named Amy Bong discovered a small note about slime mold in Octavia Butler's journal from 1988. And she was inspired by slime mold's ability to exist as single cells or as a multicellular organism, and incorporated that property into an alien species she created in one of her books. So it comes back to this idea of who's looking into the future. Slime mold resonated and inspired a queer Black woman in a way that it might not a straight white male author. And I really love that in her notes, she doesn't look to figure out the slime mold, but rather sits with it as a possible model for a different way of being. And Octavia Butler also created the Earthseed religion in her book, The Parable of the Sower. And I love this idea that, that God has changed. And it makes me think about what would a society with this type of religion look like? What type of story would they tell about robots? And continuing on this theme of change, I think there's this deep legacy of resistance. I see activists like Angela Davis as Afrofuturists. I love, in this quote, she's kind of subverting the Serenity Prayer, which is a well-known prayer. Some of you might know, but it basically goes, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And to me, the Serenity Prayer is a sign of the way religion has been used as a form of social control. I mean, it's called the Serenity Prayer and not the tear down the system prayer. But I love Angela Davis's reinterpretation, where she says, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And so this quote from James Baldwin, I've kind of seen circulating recently, and I really like this sense of urgency behind it. So he says, you always told me it takes time. It's taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time. But how much time do you want for your progress? So there's this feeling that, we're behind schedule. And, I think we could dig into why that is, but I thought instead we might explore who's ahead of schedule, who is living in the future already. So you can take a couple of minutes to explore these pockets of uneven distribution, as William Gibson called them. And I was recently introduced to this idea of Gulf Futurism. It's a term that was coined by two artists, Fatima Al-Qadiri and Sophia Al-Maria. And so as Qadiri says, Gulf Futurism is this obsession with the new. It's about abandoning or destroying the old. And Al-Maria notes that this has led to a form of future shock, like what Alvin Toffler described. As she puts it, glass and steel came head to head with wool and camels, and it feels like there's been this quantum leap in time. So the photo on the left is Dubai in 1990, and on the right is what it looks like today. I mean, it's amazing in its own way. And Maria describes this endless, naive optimism that doesn't exist in the West anymore. It's the sense that you can transform your environment, build the tallest buildings, that there are no limits on your growth. But I think we see echoes of this obsession with the new in Italian futurism and the Silicon Valley motto of move fast and break things. If you've never read the Italian Futurist Manifesto, I'd recommend it. It's pretty intense. And I get it to an extent, that they're worried about living in the past or being stuck in the past, what we might call sort of a Disneyification of their culture. But I also know that they were really into fascism, and I think that's the risk you take when you refuse to acknowledge your history. So where Gulf futurism differs from Italian futurism is this this tension between pushing forwards but also desperately clinging to the moral rules of the past. So what does all of this mean for robots? Well, in 2017, Dubai was the first city to release robocops onto the street. At the time, they were not allowed to make arrests, but the government is planning to expand their capabilities over the next decade and ultimately wants them to be 25% of their police force. I can't say this is a preferable future, but it's certainly a possible or even probable future that we can learn from. But to end on a more optimistic note, I'd like to look at what I'm calling Shinto Futurism. So I was trying to think of other countries that are living in the future, and naturally Japan came to mind. They're also well known for their robotics industry, so I thought it'd be interesting to see if they shared some of the same fears about robots that we have here in the US. And I found this article from Joy Ito, the former head of the MIT Media Lab, where he notes that the hierarchies of Judeo-Christian religions means that those cultures tend to fear their overlords. But belief systems like Shinto and Buddhism are more conducive to have faith in peaceful coexistence. I think this quote from Osamu Tezuka, the creator of Astro Boy, helps explain the Shinto perspective a little bit better. He says that the Japanese don't make a distinction between man as a superior creature and the world about him. Everything is fused together, and we accept robots easily along with the wide world about us. The insects, the rocks, it's all one. And so in Shintoism, everything has a spirit. I think a perfect example of this are the Aibo robot dogs, which kind of fall into this category of companion robots. You can think of them like a more advanced Tamagotchi. And they have a camera for facial recognition, and they're really focused less on utility and more on creating an emotional connection. As you see in the quote there, the owner kind of talks about how Oliver, the robotic dog, hid under the table when she first turned him on. He was shy, but he warmed up to her, and that she never thought of him as a toy, that he was a member of the family. And so, the Aibos aren't in production anymore, and owners of old or dead robo-dogs will send them to this company where they basically become organ donors. But before that company strips them for parts, a Buddhist priest conducts a funeral ceremony. And so, they're organ donors for the robo-dogs that are still in good working condition. And so, you have this funeral ceremony where the priest releases the spirits and makes the robot a machine. And this company won't take part until that transformation has occurred. And so I think this is just a really different way of thinking about robots. If all things inherently have a soul, then you lose that entire cautionary tale about playing God and kind of like giving a thing that soul. And just to wrap up here, I'm not totally sure what my preferable future is when it comes to robots. But I do know that I want to see as many options as possible. I want to know who this robot is and why they eat blue grapes. And I think a diversity of nonlinear perspectives will allow us to imagine all the gray area between and beyond the dishwasher and destroyer, or even break down that dichotomy altogether. Quote from Toni Morrison, I think, really says it all. Our past is bleak, our future dim, but I am not reasonable. A reasonable man adjusts to his environment. An unreasonable man does not. All progress, therefore, depends on the unreasonable man. I prefer not to adjust to my environment. I refuse the prison of I and choose the open spaces of we. And so I just want to, with that in mind, I want to leave you with 3 questions. So the first is, what stories have been told? Whose stories are missing? And what story will you tell? And I truly believe that we should all be futurists. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.